What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. Welcome to day 293 of the 365-day graphic novel review challenge. I sound a little bit sick, so you're just going to have to bear with me a little bit as I soldier through this review. Today, I'm going to be talking about Seven Soldiers of Victory Volume 1 by Grant Morrison and a whole slew of artists. J.H. Williams III, Simone Bianchi, Cameron Stewart, Ryan Sook, Fraser Irving, and Mick Gray. Talking about this series, this was requested to me by Sid Part 2 way at the beginning of the year. He asked if I would be able to cover this series. I said yes. I always intended to get around to it. I did not intend for it to take as long as it did. This is going to be one of the most difficult things for me to talk about because really this is all one giant 31 issue arc, but it's split up into 4 volumes, or at least the way I have it, it's collected in 4 volumes. It's also collected into 2 larger size volumes. I don't have those, so I will be talking about Seven Soldiers of Victory for the next 4 days. Actually, it's just called Seven Soldiers of Victory here, but I think also whenever it was first coming out, it was just called Seven Soldiers. But anyway, this particular volume collects the first 2 issues of the Shining Knight miniseries, the Manhattan Guardian miniseries, the Satana miniseries, and then the first issue of the Clarion the Witch Boy miniseries, and then the first bookend issue. There are 7 4-issue minis that compose this entire thing, plus the 2 bookend issues. And in the foreword to this volume, Grant Morrison talks about how his goal was to do a superhero team book where none of the characters actually interact with each other or even meet each other, and then they all have to work together to save the day. That is a really interesting idea, and you can see that at work here, where Zatanna, she's off doing her own thing. She doesn't meet the Manhattan Guardian. In fact, Zatanna, she's in San Francisco, and the Manhattan Guardian is in Manhattan, so they don't even kind of come close to each other, but then you're seeing these threads throughout this entire volume, and you will continue to see those threads be pulled tighter as you go through each volume. The main thing that binds all of these minis together is the Schita. I mentioned that in yesterday's video where I talked about JLA, the Ultramarine Corps. The Schita are these little tiny fairies that ride mosquitoes, and they are led by Gloriana, the fairy queen, and basically she and Schita, they are the big bad of this entire series. We do get to see Nebula, who showed up in JLA Ultramarine Corps. We see him a little bit here in the Shining Knight miniseries, but he doesn't do a whole lot yet. I don't remember if he plays a very big role in this miniseries. I feel like he has to, because he was kind of set up as being a big deal in the Ultramarine Corps story, but so far he hasn't done a whole lot. So anyway, I really like the idea of 7 superheroes who all have to fight against a common foe without actually meeting each other or really working together in the traditional sense of a superhero story. I like that quite a bit. It's going to be difficult for me to talk about this because none of these 4-issue minis are contained within one volume. So I'm only going to be talking about the first 2 issues of Zatanna, the first 2 issues of Manhattan Guardian, etc. What's great about that is that within each 4-issue mini, each 2 issues kind of act as their own little mini arc. So the Shining Knight, the first 2 issues, is kind of sort of the origin story for this new and improved Shining Knight. And so it will be fairly easy for me to talk about each chunk of this book. So let's go ahead and start with the bookend issue. Basically, this kind of sets up the conflict of this world. If you haven't read the Ultramarine Corps story, this kind of gets you in on the ground floor and gets everything rolling. We are introduced to a group of 7 D-list superhero characters. They're all just really pathetic, and they are all gathered by the original Vigilante, who is from the original Seven Soldiers of Victory, which was itself basically just the dregs of the DC universe of the 1940s, all joining forces together. They were like the complete opposite of the Justice Society. If the Justice Society was the best heroes of the DC universe, the Seven Soldiers was pretty much the opposite of that. Anyone who's a fan of the original Seven Soldiers, sorry, but it's true. So the Vigilante, he was like one of the last ones to survive from the original Seven Soldiers, and he gathers all these really pathetic superheroes to help him kill this giant spider, and then things don't go the way that they intended, and then we find out that things are being manipulated behind the scenes by these 7 guys who all look like Grant Morrison. Kind of reminds me a little bit of the Dr. 13 miniseries that I talked about a few days ago, but anyway, these guys, I don't know if they're angels or gods or aliens, I don't know, but anyway, they are in, they're kind of manipulating explaining all of the events of this story. And then whenever things don't go the way that Greg Saunders intended for them to go in the opening arc or the opening story, these guys are like, okay, we've got to start again. We've got to get 7 characters who are going to fight against the Schita. And that's what gets us started here. Our first character is the Shining Knight, who is kind of sort of a Captain America-esque character in that he is a man out of time. He is from Camelot, but this is not the same Camelot that we have seen before in the DC Universe. We are told here that the Camelot that the Shining Knight comes from, this particular Shining Knight comes from, is from 10,000 years ago. And we do see at one point in a picture of the original 7 Soldiers of Victory that the original Shining Knight does exist in this universe. So there are at least 2 Shining Knights. And as I understand it, the idea is that Camelot and all the Knights of the Round Table are a recurring motif throughout history, and that they will occur multiple times. So this particular Shining Knight and the Camelot that he came from, they came from 10,000 years ago, but then the Shining Knight from the original 7 Soldiers of Victory may have only come from 500 years ago. We don't know. But I think that's a pretty interesting idea. It gives us an opening so that we can do a revamp of this character without having to just say the original Shining Knight didn't exist at all, or try to work in that Shining Knight into this version of the 7 Soldiers of Victory. I really like that idea. I like the man out of time aspect. I think it works really well here. That's basically all that we get to see with the Shining Knight, is establishing the original context that he existed in, and then showing him existing in the present day, and kind of getting his bearings and figuring out what his mission is now going to be. Meanwhile, we have the Manhattan Guardian. He is a pretty average, ordinary guy. I would have to say, out of all of the characters that are going to be featured in the series, he's probably the most normal, the most average guy. He is a former cop who has gone through some bad stuff for a couple years now. He's been fighting depression, and then he becomes the Manhattan Guardian. He is basically a mascot for this newspaper called the Manhattan Guardian, which is kind of like the Weekly World News if it existed in the DC universe. I don't know if any of you guys remember the Weekly World News. It used to be this really crazy newspaper that you would see in the aisles at Walmart, where it would say like a pregnant man gives birth and stuff like that, vampire boy spotted in Russia, whatever. This newspaper that Jake works for is kind of like that, except that a lot of the stuff they talk about is actually real, because the DC universe has weird stuff like a vampire boy and a pregnant man giving birth and stuff like that. And basically he's there to protect the people, protect the newspaper, and protect the writers who are working for it. It's really weird and awesome. It feels like a modern day Jack Kirby comic, not necessarily in the artwork by Cameron Stewart. The art looks a lot like, actually it kind of looks a little bit like Ramon Villalobos, or I would even say maybe Richard Corbin a little bit. It's by Cameron Stewart, and I've never seen him do his style in this way. I like what he's doing here, but it doesn't look like normal Cameron Stewart. But anyway, the writing here and the story feels very much like something Jack Kirby would have done, which is very appropriate since he actually worked on the Guardian at one time and used that character in his Fourth World stuff, incorporating the Guardian into the Cadmus stuff in the 70s. So it feels appropriate that this is kind of aping the style of Jack Kirby a little bit in terms of writing. But I like him. This story is very weird, very bizarre. You've got underground subway pirates, and he's trying to rescue his wife, and then we get to see his origin story. I really love the interview process that he goes for. I'm not going to spoil that. If you haven't read this, you need to read this just for the interview that he goes through to become the Manhattan Guardian. But that kind of sums up his origin story. And then we get Zatanna. I've never really liked Zatanna before. Before Identity Crisis, she didn't really have much of a personality or really any character traits at all. She was basically just a pair of fishnet stockings. I am 99% sure that people who like her, the only reason that they like her is because she looks kind of cute in those fishnet stockings. Until Identity Crisis, where we find out that she was a little bit morally gray. You could even say morally black, even, because of the part that she played in the backstory of Identity Crisis. And this is kind of sort of building off of that. We find out that Zatanna is trying to get away from the superhero side of things. She has lost her magic powers. She's part of a support group for superheroes who are very low on the totem pole, and that actually kind of connects to the bookend issue. This support meeting that Zatanna is in at the beginning of the first issue actually takes place before the bookend issue, because one of the people who was on that really terrible superhero team, she's there, part of the support group. But anyway, Zatanna is saying that she lost her powers, and that if she can get her powers back, she just wants to go back to being a stage magician, and she is a spellaholic, and basically she's just going through a personal life crisis. And I really like the idea of her trying to get away from the superhero side of things, and she just wants to simplify her life. And she's got this apprentice tagging along, and she doesn't really know anything about this apprentice. She doesn't really want to be a tutor to this girl, but she's trying to get this girl back to her family. I really like all of that going on with Zatanna. It's very different. It's very quirky. It's not something that you usually see in a superhero book, and it makes me interested in Zatanna. That's something that I never thought I would say, and unfortunately, after the Seven Soldiers thing was all over, pretty much nobody really went to this version of Zatanna. She has been used many times since this story ended, but nobody was really using this particular version of Zatanna that Grant Morrison was doing, and that's a shame because I really like what he was doing here with her. Then we get one issue of Clarion the Witch Boy, and this is a little weird, but I like it. So there was a version of Clarion the Witch Boy. Actually, technically, counting this one, there's been 3 versions of Clarion the Witch Boy. There was the original, who was an antagonist to Etrigan the Demon, and then there was a version of the character who showed up in Peter David's Young Justice series, pretty much entirely different from the one from the Etrigan series. And then you have this one, and I'll talk a little bit about this more whenever I get towards the end of this series, but apparently this is meant to be the one from the Jack Kirby Demon series, but it's very weird about how it goes there. So anyway, Clarion is part of an underground society of Puritans. They all practice sorcery, and it is forbidden for them to interact with the outside world, and Clarion is a rebel, and he wants to go and experience the outside world. And that's basically what we get here. I really love the artwork there. It is by, what was his name? It is Fraser Irving. Fraser Irving has worked with Morrison before, at least a little bit, on the post-Final Crisis Batman stuff. He worked with him a little bit there. I really like Fraser Irving's art. In fact, I like all of the artists here, with the exception of Simone Bianchi. Nothing against him. His art is serviceable, but it's not really my cup of tea. At times, I have trouble figuring out what's going on. Sometimes I'll see something and I'm thinking, wait a minute, there's a little bit of a disconnect here between the writing and the art. For example, at one point, this guy is talking to the Shining Knight's horse, and he says something like, yeah, you're probably wondering where all these scars came from, and he says that his neck, it looks like gills, but then I'm like holding the book really close to my face, and I'm saying, I don't see any scars on this guy. It's one of those things where I feel like there was a little bit of a communication problem between Morrison and Bianchi. I don't know. Maybe they had a fine time working together, but I didn't really like Bianchi's work. I usually don't in the stuff that I've read from him before. Usually his art just doesn't really do anything for me. But anyway, that's about all that I have to say about this book. Like I said, it's going to be very difficult for me to actually talk about this series because I'm talking about each mini-series in chunks, and then there's still 3 more minis that I haven't even gotten to yet, that haven't appeared yet. But it's very interesting. I really love this series. I highly recommend that you guys check it out. I'm going to be saying that with each video here. What I like is that we're seeing an overall threat. We're seeing each of these characters kind of in their relation to the overall threat, but then we're also seeing other minor connections. For example, we see these recurring elementals that have showed up in 3 of the 4 minis that I talked about here. There's an Earth elemental in the Manhattan Guardian miniseries who works for the newspaper, and we see an Air elemental working for this mobster in the Shining Knight miniseries, and then technically Zatanna, she captures what she calls a Fire elemental. I don't know if that's related to the other 2. I'm assuming so. You don't accidentally use a word like elemental, especially when you've used it twice already. So that's kind of cool. You get to see little connections like that that might go over your head the first time you read it, and then reading it the second time you might be like, oh, I see what you're doing there. I really like also there's a connection between the Manhattan Guardian and the Clarion the Witch Boy because Manhattan Guardian is fighting subway pirates, and Clarion, he lives in an underground Puritan community, and they mentioned the Puritans in the Manhattan Guardian miniseries, and in Clarion they mentioned that they are trading with people from the outer world. So there's little connections like that where you're not going to see a full-blown crossover, but you are seeing hints of an almost crossover happening, and I like that quite a bit. I would probably feel very differently if I was reading the series in singles and I was just reading, say, Clarion the Witch Boy, but I wasn't reading the Manhattan Guardian. But since I'm reading it in chronological order, as I'm assuming as it was meant to happen, as it was meant to be read, I'm enjoying this, and I don't have a problem with the almost crossover stuff that's going on here. So those are my thoughts on Seven Soldiers of Victory Volume 1. I hope that you guys liked this review, and if you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I will be back tomorrow to talk about another volume of Seven Soldiers of Victory. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.